Hello, all. Welcome to my dungeon, I guess, where I spend the overwhelming majority of Professor Gable's time in my office. Yeah, this is kind of where I grade the essays and write poetry and do all that crazy stuff. Well, today I'm going to give you a quick little lesson on poetry. And I want to talk a little bit about what we think of poetry, really, because we have poetry such as, whenever we say poetry, we have this classic idea of poetry. We think about Shakespeare, right? We think about maybe John Donne, maybe Milton, maybe even Geoffrey Chaucer, and we go to the Canterbury Tales, and then we start reciting that in Middle English. As most of you concurrent, you probably are in senior English, so you encountered some level of the Canterbury Tales at some point. The one that opererar with the Schadersut, the Dritte Match hath perished to the Ruta, which is the Middle English of it, which they used to make us all memorize back in high school and recite in the Middle English for a midterm grade. It was fun times. So here's the thing. That type of formal, academic, high art poetry is fantastic. It's beautiful. I mean, you think of the Percy Shelleys, you think of the Lord Byrons, you think of the Emily Dickinsons, you even think of the Walt Whitmans, you know, "Oh Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done, we've weathered every wreck, the prize we sought is won." But then we also have the poetry of the modern man and the poetry of the everyman. And this is a lot different than the poetry that we sometimes encounter in our text. Now, in our text, I have you reading like The Chimney Sweep by William Blake, who's one of the early romantic poets. And when I say romantic, I don't mean they're talking about romance. It means that they're dealing with romantic ideas. What romantic ideas are, it's the idea that humans are essentially good, and that we deserve freedom, and that we deserve freedom of thought, freedom of expression. We don't deserve censorship. We don't deserve the censorship of society upon us. And this can be found through all of the romantic poets: William Blake, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Wordsworth, Percy Shelley, John Keats, Lord Byron, and there's a huge list. I mean, the Rossetti sisters and others. That's very real in that aspect. Now, modern times, poetry has changed. We had spontaneous prosody poetry in the 1940s, kind of the Jazz Age poetry, which came out of Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and William S. Burroughs. And then we had what they call street poetry, which was more Charles Bukowski. It's the poetry of the poor man on the street, the poetry of the drunkard, the poetry of the downtrodden, the poetry of the outcast and the ugly. And then you have the higher poetry of today, such as Billy Collins, and he wrote the poem Names to commemorate the survivors, all those that perished in the 9/11 attacks. And there's a contrast between these two. And then we also have the poetry that we encounter almost daily. The poetry of lyrics, the poetry of song, the poetry that we hear. Not a beat, but the actual content of what the artists are saying. And that is poetry. Whether you're dealing with the works of, Jack Kerouac in the Jazz Age, or you're dealing with the works of Matisyahu, who is currently, he's a singer, or Tupac, or or NWA even in the early 90s, they were speaking a type of poetry that spoke to the reality of their time and condition. See, poetry is an emotional response to your time and the condition in which you find yourself in. That's the Mr. Gable definition, but it's the one I've had for a long time. It's how you react to things. Poetry can be rhyming, it can be lyrical, it can be in a beat, it can have a refrain, it can have a chorus. But poetry can also have, it can be played with, and it can be manipulated, and it can be changed. Whether it's a sonnet, that the only rule may, we know that an Elizabethan sonnet may be 14 lines, and it has an A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G, rhyme scheme, right? We know that. But what about, well, if we just play with that, we just make it 14 lines, and then we start playing with the cadence and the rhythm, and we play with the symbols, and then we play with the rhyme scheme a little bit, and then we put a Petrarchan rhyme scheme into a Shakespearean sonnet. So it's A, B, B, C, C, D, D, E, F, G, E, F, G, and you have all these different types of things where you can play with it today that we didn't have back in the day. So poetry is something that is a creative way to use words to express emotion and to convey the conditions with which we live. And I think that's really what poetry is all about. And when we realize that poetry is meant to hit us in the heart, and then upon the second or third time we come to it, it hits us on the brain, hits us in the brain, then we start to realize the power of really good song lyrics. I like songs, not, there's some people that say, man, I really like the song based upon the beat. And yeah, that's true. Okay, I like some songs based upon the beat. But the best songs for me are the ones that have the lyrics that go with it, that back it up, that tell us something deep and meaningful. There's a song by one of my favorite singer-songwriters, and I won't tell you who he is. He's not very well known, but he says, I was born a bitter old man whose heart was broken in 1936, Catalonia. And this is very interesting because it's poetry, because he's a young man when he's writing this. He's in his 20s, but he's saying that he was born a bitter old man because of something that happened in Catalonia, Spain in 1936, and he was born in 1980 or 80s sometime. So older than you guys, but I mean, still, he's relatively young. He's not like 70. And when he was writing it, he was even younger. He was in his late 20s. So it's weird how something that can happen so far back, and if you don't know what happened in Catalonia, Spain in 1936, then you don't get that lyric, and it prompts us to want to look it up to see what emotion and what emotive force he's talking about with this. So, with that, I want to read to you a couple of quick poems, okay? And these are just some of my favorite poems to kind of get y'all started on the poetry section. One of them's by one of my favorite poets. His name is Delmore Schwartz. If you ever want to get depressed, read some Delmore Schwartz. But this is just a beautiful poem that I have read on multiple occasions at multiple poetry readings. It's called This Is a Poem I Wrote at Night Before the Dawn. This is a poem I wrote before I died and was reborn, after the years of the apples ripening and the eagles soaring, after the festival here, the small flowers gleaming like the first stars, and the horses cantering and romped away like the experience of skill mastered in serene power, grasped and governed by reins lightly held by knowing hands. The horses had cantered away, far enough away, so that I saw the horses' heads farther and farther away, and saw that they had reached the dark horizon on the dusk of day, and were and seemed black thunderheads, massy and ominous waves in the doomed sky. And it was then, for the first time, then that I said, as I must always say, all through living death of night, it is always darkness before delight. The long night is always the beginning, the vivid blossom of day. Interesting poem. Love it. Let's see if I can find the other one that I love by. Oh. I think that's the only one I have marked by Delmore in this particular text. Let's see here. Yep, I think it is. So let me then compare that. This is one of my chapbooks. By the way poetry books work is very rarely do they publish poetry books. Poetry books don't sell. So they publish them in little chapbooks. And if these sell really well, then a bigger publisher will pick them up and put them into a paperback. And then if the paperback sells really well, then they'll put it in a hardback. And then, you know, it kind of moves from there. Me being the poet that I am, this is as far as I've gotten. And I'm okay with that, okay? So let me go over here and see. And as I said, this is one of my poetry books. This was a poem, and I totally had a different poem picked out to read to you guys, but this is the one. It makes me laugh every time I see it. It's called Jitters, and I wrote it after I'd had about 3 too many cups of coffee, okay? I'm anxious today, jittery they say, and I am left sitting here shaking, not because I'm nervous or have something to say, but because my mind has gone astray and my hands shake, anticipating the badness of the dude shouts obscenities, and I jump, and they haven't directed toward me, but I shake my jittery shakes, and I think, and I think, and I think until I thunk, and then I debunk in my jittery brain game. Shame, and my hands shake, my brain shakes. I do the hippie shake, and my heart flutters with the thought of the evil intentions of people that I don't know and will never understand. And isn't that how it works today? Say, man, the nameless mass is the ruling class. So I decided to run for office. I might just win. My jittery word that rhymes with class. Okay. So yes, this is all. Oh, here's one. A moment of romance. It's called Moment. There's nothing like meeting an immediate connection with someone. It touches in a place of the dead soul and revives the spirit. It kicks the heart in gear and booms the awareness. I shake at the realization of the awareness, the overwhelming nature of the it, the divine it, the immortal it, like an electric socket with plug flaming out, sparking, shooting a fire flash phenomenon burn, electric fires of intensity. The moment of meeting, the moment of meaning, meaning and soul suicide of the self, all for the it. Okay, so that's an old book. This is a newer book that I've written more recently. Let's see here. Here's one where it talks about different genres. In modern poetry, we play different genres. Of course, an ode is normally a long romantic poet about some idealized ideal of nature. I instead wrote an ode to a squirrel, which is a very typical title for an ode, like Ode to a Nightingale and such. Mine is not long. Here's what mine said. Ode to the squirrel. I'm sorry I killed you today. You didn't deserve that death, and I tried to miss your sprint across the road, and I loved your furry tail, and your bravery was unmatched in history, and I mourn you, you know. I wanted more for you, and like that, gone in an instant. And life is fragile and tired, and I wish you had turned, or I had turned. I wish you knew that I was not your death bringer. I wanted to help, not hinder. And in the new light of this life, I pray you fly from tree to tree and eat your fill of nuts and bone. Enjoy each day as I pray for you, Mr. Squirrel. Enjoy each day, and I will miss you. I might have accidentally hit a squirrel with my car. So that's kind of what all's been going on with all that. So all of this is to say that you can take a poem and you can analyze it for the words and the lyrics. And the way that you do that is you have to do a cursory reading of it. Like you're going to be reading in your text Chimney Sweep by William Blake. And then there's going to be several companion pieces that kind of go with it. You want to read them silently. Read them out loud next. Hear them. Hear the rhythm and the cadence and the beat. The reason why I read you poetry today was so that you could hear how the beat should come out of a poem naturally. You should be able to find it within the text. Hear this rhyme scheme. Then Go verse by verse, finding the subjects and the verbs. Who is doing what? What's happening? People get lost in that. That's where they get confused in poetry. It's because you're not keeping track of who the actor is and what action is being done, because the wordplay can sometimes trick us. And then after we've done that, we go in deeper. What are the symbols? What are the meanings? What's the author really wanting to get? Is the squirrel symbolic of something else? Was the it symbolic of something else? Were the horses in Delmore Swart's poem symbolic of something else? And if so, what? And what it mean? And that's where you really have to start thinking about it and reading into it and seeing what you can do with it. That's really where the rubber meets the road. Now, in your assignment, when you're going to start talking about poetry, we're going to have a poetry test, so you are going to have all this base knowledge as well. But you are going to be asked, what are some of the underlying themes between multiple poems? What's the poem really trying to say? Is it really trying to say love is grand? Love is sad? Is it trying to say that it's bad to exploit people? Maybe like the chimney sweep? What's it trying to say? And then what are the other poems trying to say in connection with that? And then you put it all together, and you kind of get it going and see what you have there. Now, hopefully that you've been doing in your regular classes, so you can take that and kind of run with it. If not, I may add a short addendum lesson on how you compare and find the themes and how you write about that and how you compare and contrast those things. But we're going to see how that goes before we get to that. I just wanted you to get the overarching how you read poetry, how you approach poetry in the 21st century. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to seeing what everybody has to write and say about it.